presentation is basically, the title says here, if I can read it, and anyone can read it, The Ancient Foundations of Constitutionalism. The topic of this conference is constitutionalism, and therefore we are confronted with a problem, that is, what does constitutionalism mean? Constitutionalism in many senses has different meanings. There is, in fact, I would divide it in two different fundamental traditions. One, the Anglo-American tradition, which understands constitutionalism through a tradition of the Anglo-Saxon legal system of law, through common law, through the crown structure of the English crown, and how the state development of the English crown, through common law, created a system of limited government and restrictions of government power. But there's another tradition of what we call constitutionalism, one from Germanic tradition, that is the Riksdag, the idea of the law state. Now, some argue that this comes out of early modern thinking, particularly in the early Renaissance Enlightenment. Some others argue that it's medieval. But that's not my goal here. My goal here is about the ancient foundations. Because whatever we can say about the birth of the Riksdag, or the idea of the modern state, or the modern structure, and its attempt to govern itself by laws and restrictions, and not be an absolute state, and all of this comes from the traditions that they inherited from the Greeks and Romans. Itself is an invention of the Greeks, we would say. Some would say invention, some would say discovery, but the idea here is distinctions between political rule and royal rule, or hegemonic rule. The idea of political rule was that it's tied with the emergence around the 7th to 6th century, the rise of the polis, which was composed of, the term is the polites of the citizens, okay? Now, Sam Feiner, the English comparative political scientist, in his work on the history of government, made a very important argument that the Greek polis is a very unique concept, because what it was that all the citizens, it was more like a joint stock company, okay? Where a joint stock company is all the members or partners in it have equal ownership rights to it. But the problem here is that therefore every citizen could act for the whole sake of the whole political system. So therefore, if an Athenian is in Sparta and there's a discussion among the Spartan leaders, the Spartan people, about something aspect of the Athenian, any Athenian citizen would be able to represent the Athenian society, the Athens at that moment. Everyone deliberates. All the citizens together in the ecclesia deliberate this idea. They are joint owners. They're not owners, but this is the problem. This is the move we say from Weber and other people, the move from patrimonial governance, where you understood everything as ownership, versus a kind of what we call civic ownership, where instead of owning it, you are a caretaker or a shepherd of the common inheritance, the common stock. The polis is a form of koinonia. Koinonia, this is the problem, the meaning of koinonia. It's hard to translate because koinonia means common, koinonia means kind of rule. English sometimes has been translated as partnership, but that's problematic because it assumes more voluntariness. An association seems too weak. Community sounds pretty well, but the problem here is that this whole problem of what does community mean in contrast to other social things like society. The famous debate here. The city or the polis, or what the Latins would call the civitas, right? This would be the common political body. This is the koinonia that human beings can fulfill their character, their nature, and their being as human beings, as political animals, social animals. Now, there's an ordering of this. How do you order this? Because all the citizens do it, there's going to be a different situation. There's going to be, the polis is not a unitary whole. It is a families and households, and therefore every household or type of household are going to have different ways of life, different ways of sustenance, different ways of maintaining itself. And therefore this will cause a divide among the multitude and as well as among the elites or notables of the society. And that therefore every city is going to have a different ordering based upon the makeup of the community, and therefore which part of this community is going to dominate, is going to rule, have authority, will shape the direction of the character of the politeia, okay? The regime, in that sense. So therefore, the concept of the politeia, or the regime, becomes the defining concept of the political structure. But this doesn't have limits, okay? There's no limits in this. The Greeks do not have fear of power that their inheritors, the Romans, will have. This is because one is that nature itself, in other words, if you look at the development of the polis, the geography of nature itself limited the scope and size of how the polis could be. And even the Greeks themselves, with their conceptions of gods, the Eurimenes, the Furies, would limit the power of fathers over their children to degrees that did not exist in the Romans. The Roman father was absolute. The Roman father had life and death, power of life and death over his children, even at elder age, even though he may not be executed. So if we look at the difference between the Rex, the Roman king, right, which was a derivative of the father, versus the Basileus, who is more kind of, it has the similar root, but it's not as ruthless, it's not as fierce. It is not powerful as much as there's kind of, the Basileus ultimately ends up becoming less of a kind of a regime and more kind of an institution, like an office. That's what happens to all Greek cities. The kingships become offices as the cities mature in that sense. But the Roman model has a problem. The Roman model fears the Rex. And what happens is when the Rex is overturned, the Romans create the res publica, the public thing. The public thing. And this is a construct of the citizens. Now there's a distinction between Greece and Rome here, that Rome has the idea that the citizens are all equal. The Roman model did not envision all the citizens being equal. There was a clear status distinction between those who were seen better and those who were seen as the plebs, right? And therefore, what the Roman model envisioned was more of a kind of, they'd say, what is that word? It's called centaure. It's kind of a situation where the leading ones lead and represent the people, the client-patron relationships. In Rome, you have a higher tradition of client-patron relationships. And as such, you have a different style of politics. First is you have fear of the Rex. What do you do with the power of the Rex? You chop it up. You divide it. The Greeks don't necessarily fear power that much. So therefore, they're not going to, they will divide it for the purpose of efficiency, right? For functionality, division of labor. But they won't divide it out of fear of power, of centralization of power. And this is the Roman distinction. The Romans will insist on two consuls. If there's going to be tributes of the people, they're going to represent the people, it has to be more than one. You cannot have just one. You have to have, and then every tribute can nullify the other tribute. Every consul can nullify the other consul. This concept of division of power is a uniquely Roman one. That this, out of the fear of this concentration of power in any one person. And we can argue, therefore, if we're going to talk about constitutionalism as a constraint, mechanisms of institutional constraint of power, we have to be looking at the Greeks may be problematic. Looking at the Greeks where power is absolute and that the ecclesia can govern absolutely and it's unchallenged, whereas the Roman system constantly tries to check the power of whoever exercises it. And therefore, it is from this inheritance. Now, to understand our tradition now, therefore, people like Aristotle, in other words, who are the authors of this? Who are the thinkers who deal with this? Now, the problem here is the Romans never put together a good thinker who describes this phenomenon. You have to go to Polybius, a Greek thinker like Polybius, and even Polybius doesn't add, in book 6 of his history, doesn't really give a good job of this. The closest understanding we get from this is Aristotle, but then Aristotle's politics is forgotten soon after it's written. It's just ignored. Because the polis is, as Sam Finer says, by the middle of the 4th century BC, the polis is a dead end. It's no longer a viable political form in the modern world. That what's happened is the hegemons, the leagues and the hegemons have, and this is kind of the end of political life. And at the same time, you see around the same time, a century later, in the 2nd BC, the same thing is happening to the Roman Republic. It is dying because of its size and its success. And it can no longer manage itself as a republic. And therefore, what we have is a problem that for a long time, Aristotle's just forgotten. The Romans don't study and talk about him in his politics. They'll talk about his ethics and his other things. The Arabs know nothing of his politics. It is only around and this becomes a very important revitalization of Aristotelian political science, the foundation. That Aristotle becomes the father of our political science in the Middle Ages through the Latin, through Morbig's translation. Now, this is necessary because a century or so earlier, there's a rebirth of political rule, political life, when the northern Italian cities, and sometimes the Hanseatic cities in the north, try to assert independence from the emperor. I have about 5 minutes left, I think. Who's keeping time? Good? So the emperors of the north, the Christian, Holy Roman Emperor, was trying to always trying to, even though it's a feudal structure and a feudal things, always trying to centralize control. And he was trying to exercise control over the 3 cities. It is the rise of the cities. Now, they did not have a theory to defend them. They could turn to Plato, but Plato doesn't help you much. The Christian writer, St. Augustine, seems to not offer a republican treatise, doesn't want a popular government. He kind of argues for monarchs and things like this. So the tradition, Cicero is kind of useful, but Cicero never really, his glorification of Scipio, which is what bit of the Respublica that the Middle Ages had, emphasizes the great leader, emphasizes the absolute leader similar to Cyrus, right? So there is no literature that really defends a political rule of systems of limited popular government. So therefore, the rediscovery of Aristotle's politics is very important. But there's a problem. The problem is when Morbig translates it, he translates it differently, in a way that he invents new words. He's too faithful to the Greek. So you get words like, instead of using civitas for the political, right? The Roman word civitas or pupilis, right? He creates the word political. And what is the civitas, the city, the civitas verb? This is a koinonia, but he uses the word communitas. The communitas politicum, the political community. It is also this is where you have problems. He calls it the communitas perfectus. The civitas is the communitas perfectus. Now, this leads to big problems because everyone said, well, this means the ideal community. No, it doesn't. It's the Greek word he's translating is autarkos, right? It's self-sufficient. It means that the city is sufficient as a community. It doesn't mean that it doesn't need anything. It means as a habitat by which human beings can achieve fulfill their nature as a social being, as a political animal, that they can achieve happiness. They can achieve even happiness has to be quoted. It's eudaimonia, which means flourishing. They are able to flourish and develop and live a life together. They are able to have this. Now the problem here is that they take this, but what is the reality of the Middle Ages at this time? It's feudalism, right? There is no concept of feudalism. So therefore, what they need to do is they need to reread Aristotle's discussion of the politeia called politeia, regime called regime, as a discussion of feudalism in Book 4. Book 4, and particularly Book 4 chapters 7, 8, 9, and 11, 12, and 13 get rewritten. The blending of any regime, because all politeia are blended. Because remember, the polis is always a discrete structure of discrete parts. So every polis or every regime is going to be a construct of blended parts. And so it's not a specific regime in the Greek, but in the Latin it becomes a specific regime. More so, and it becomes a specific regime that represents different institutional parts, that of the people, the kingship, and the aristocracy. And therefore, the Latin commentators will always understand this. This begins the tradition of the mixed constitution, and the Latin tradition of this 12, it's around 15, 14, 15, 16th century. This idea of the mixed constitution, this idea of the mixed constitutional order, where there is going to be restraint, not absolute power, but limited power. And the issue here is, I would argue that what's missing in Aristotle is the discussion of what we would later discuss as concepts under Anglo-Saxon law in America, because the American invention, federalism. This idea of this, because even the Greeks didn't understand associations of associations as a koinonia. In other words, a treaty mechanism of associations of a number of cities together is not a koinonia. It is something different. The Romans had the same problem. In other words, the Romans, when they governed and they made their arrangement under cities, the soci, they formed a societas, a contractual system. This was not understood as a kind of communitas. It's only with Cicero in some of his writings that Cicero speaks of a civil societas. But this is not about political law. This is about this interconnection between Rome and her subjects. How is this to be governed well? So therefore we have a problem here with the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages wants to have a political form where there's multiple structures of interconnection. But the Aristotelian language offers it nothing. And therefore this is the environment by which modern political theory arises. But modern political theory is rejecting the whole Middle Ages. It looks at the contestation of power that the feudal system wants. And it wants to reject it. It wants to homogenize it. So even though, and what happens is they blame Aristotle. They'll say Aristotle's the bad guy. You see this in Bodin, you see this in Hobbes, you see this in all the writers, Machiavelli, Hobbes, all the early moderns. They'll say Aristotle's the bad guy. Aristotle has cost. The reason why we're all messed up and we have this problem of competing authority is because Aristotle is Scholastics. But at the same time, people like Hobbes rely on Aristotle and use as much of Aristotle's arguments. So while he's attacking at one hand, he's still utilizing it. So there's the problem here. There is the problem of, is our language able to understand these concepts? And is theory able to understand the concept? Because I would argue that the American miracle of federalism is not theoretical. It was a construct. The Connecticut Compromise was not a theoretical. No author did it. It is not in Montesquieu. Montesquieu may speak of the federated situation, but this is not the kind of conjoined sovereignty. In other words, it was statesmen and political actors, practitioners who formed a compromise that ultimately produced a system of conjoined situations. That therefore limited government is not only limited government, it's limited government tied to zones of communities that are connected to other zones of communities. And I think I'm at my time. Thank you very much.